This podcast episode is sponsored by Burned Up Coaching and the 21-Day Challenge. If you're an entrepreneur or a high achiever, you're feeling stuck, you're feeling off your purpose, you're lacking clarity, you don't know what is stopping you, you feel like there's a blind spot, you feel like you're not getting the results that you should be, you're taking massive action, you think, and you're not getting that return on investment of your action with results in reality, then the 21-Day Challenge is here to help you uncover the blind spots, uncover what might be stopping you and keeping you from that success. We'll get clear on your purpose, break it down into bite-sized steps, and then you'll have daily accountability for 21 days to go all in to be able to achieve your top priority and crush that goal, okay? So that's the 21-Day Challenge. If you're interested and committed and ready to embark on that, send me a message, chris@beyourgps.com, or find me on Facebook and message me there, okay? Looking forward to talking to you. And then the next thing is going to be the iTunes review of the week. And this week it is by, I believe it's Tara Novan. Tara Novan. Let's see what she had to say. Or he, I'm not sure. Cheering you on, Tara said, cheering you on. Chris Burns offers a positive, encouraging, and motivational oasis in podcast land. He's genuinely committed, not just to his own success, but to his clients and listeners' ability to become their greatest possible selves, bringing in a wide range of voices to reinforce that message. Chris will cheer you on to new levels of success and fulfillment. Thanks so much, Tara Novan. We appreciate you. And if you want to give us a review, go to beyourgps.com/iTunes or search Becoming Your Greatest Possible Self on the iTunes store, and you can give us a review there. Thanks so much in advance for doing that. Now, I'm going to be bringing on this legendary human being, Mark, who is a freaking powerhouse, pardon my French, but he's just like an amazing dude, done tons of research, and is all about the science. I love geeking out on the science, so if you are excited to dive into the science of your subconscious mind, of really tapping into the power of who you can be, your identity, your greatest possible self, and designing that life, and really turning upside down the conventional wisdom that you've come to understand to be able to create a success formula and align yourself with that success formula, definitely stay tuned throughout this entire interview. It's going to be amazing. Mark's going to be really sharing the gold, and I highly recommend you grab a paper, grab a pen, be ready to write these notes, because we are going to go in depth into some really powerful stuff that will give you the keys to success, okay? So stick around and let's introduce Mark and then bring him on the show, okay? Mark Gober is an author, a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley, a former investment banker with UBS in New York, and former captain of the Princeton tennis team. His worldview was turned upside down in late 2016 when he was exposed to world-changing science, which suggested that, contrary to mainstream assumptions, consciousness is not produced by the brain. After researching extensively, he wrote An End to Upside Down Thinking to introduce the general public to these cutting-edge ideas, all in an effort to encourage a much-needed global shift in scientific and existential thinking. Mark's book has been endorsed by leading thinkers such as former Harvard neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, Nobel Peace Prize nominee Dr. Ervin Laszlo, Pixar founder Loren Carpenter, Institute of Noetic Sciences chief scientist Dr. Dean Radin, University of Virginia professor of neurobehavioral sciences Dr. Ed Kelly, and Chicken Soup for the Soul author Jack Canfield, actress Goldie Hawn, and many others. And we are absolutely freaking blessed, again, pardon my French, to have Mark here with us today. Mark, are you ready to rock it and just like absolutely knock it out of the park, my man?
I'm ready to rock it.
Awesome, dude. Awesome. Dude, you're now live on Becoming Your Greatest Possible Self. Thank you for being here, and thank you for just what you stand for in the world, really giving people access to the keys to the kingdom, man, to create their reality and live a fulfilled life where we're aware. We're aware of what is really driving, what are the leverage points to be able to have a fulfilling life and become our greatest possible selves. Thanks for being here, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive right into our question of the day, which is how to be aligned, man. And we want to know, Mark, what does alignment mean to you, and how do you become aligned?
For me, alignment is about identity. What is our identity at the most fundamental level? And for me, where I would have said identity lies if you had talked to me 2.5 years ago, is I would have said my identity is tied to my body. And all of my awareness and mind and memories and everything is tied to chemicals in my body and in my brain specifically. Right. And now, and what we'll talk about today, is that my worldview has been shifted upside down 180 degrees. And that's what my book is about, which suggests that my identity is not a body that has a consciousness, but rather it's the reverse, that it seems that our identity is our consciousness first and foremost that is experiencing the world through a body. So when you ask about alignment, for me, it's, well, what is my identity? Is my identity my consciousness, my awareness, and my being in a non-physical sense?
Right.
And aligning with that understanding is where I like to be acting from.
Wow, that's amazing, man. I'm so excited for this conversation, man. This is epic, Mark. This is going to be so much fun, man. And I love your response, because really it's not about like the physical. It's about the witness, the observing presence, the consciousness that chooses like what we align with, that creates what we align with. And I'm sure you might, if you feel free to correct me, right? I'm totally like a rudimentary understanding of this. You have way more experience with it. And I love discussing this, because it's like literally it gives us a blank slate to create from. Whatever we want, we get to choose and align with that, and then take actions that support that identity and that creation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with it. And to add to it, this idea that we are, in terms of our identity, that we are a consciousness, not a body. We're experiencing the body, which is totally, that rocked my world when I learned about it. But it has another implication, which is that when the body is not functioning, when the body dies, then the consciousness itself, because it was never produced by the body in the first place, the consciousness lives on. Right. So that's just given me a very different perspective on life. And I think it has to do with alignment as well, of that the physical is a temporary manifestation of consciousness or experience of consciousness. And having that awareness, I think, further helps with alignment.
That's amazing, man. Amazing. So, Mark, we're going to get into this even more. And for people who are just connecting with you, why don't you tell us a little bit more about like what you stand for with this, creating the book, an end to upside down thinking. We're going to get back into the journey a little bit more, but just as an overview, what that means a little bit more. Let's dive into that a bit more. Okay.
When I say upside down thinking, what I'm referring to is the conventional thinking in science and most of just modern everyday thinking. Yeah. It's called materialism. And I don't mean people who like fancy materials, like cars and fancy houses. I'm talking about a scientific term. Wow. And it basically says the following. It says that everything started 13.8 billion years ago with an event called the Big Bang, and it filled the universe with physical material we call matter. This is why it's called materialism. So now you have a huge universe with lots of physical matter, like my table here. It's made out of atoms of matter. Right. Tons of matter in this big universe. Yeah. With a big enough universe, you're bound to end up with pieces of matter interacting. Right. We call that chemistry. Okay, so we started with matter, and then we've got chemistry in this big universe. And then when you have enough random chemical reactions, you're bound to end up with a molecule that can replicate itself. Ooh. That's like DNA. Wow. Just chance says when you have enough chemical reactions, you end up with like something like DNA. The DNA leads to biology. So we started with matter, chemistry, biology. So biology is like a human being. Human being develops a brain, and then from our brain comes out our consciousness or our awareness. The subjective inner experience that you and I and anyone listening or watching to this has. We all have it. And what materialism says is we started with matter, we get consciousness through a brain. Okay? That's what I'm considering to be upside down thinking. Yeah. And that's what my whole book and the things that I'm speaking about are referring to, which is it's not matter creates consciousness, but consciousness is primary. Yeah. So matter, chemistry, biology, brains, they all occur within consciousness. It's a reverse of saying that the consciousness that we're all experiencing just comes from our body. What this is arguing is that no, everything physical is within consciousness. And that's what everything we'll talk about today is basically tying back to that. Yes,
I love this. Okay, so let's go back into the journey. How did you get this perspective, man? Where did you come up with this philosophy that like you're like, I'm so certain that this is so? When did that moment happen?
In August of 2016, I was listening to podcasts, and there was one in particular I was listening to. It was called Extreme Health Radio, Alternative Health. I was listening to health and business podcasts at the time, and there was a woman that came on the show who talked about psychic abilities. She talked about the ability to communicate with like non-physical beings, and she talked about working with energies. I had just never even heard of these things beyond science fiction. Right. I mean, so I remember like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But at the end of that episode, the woman, whose name is Laura Powers, she talked about how she has her own podcast called Healing Powers. Okay. And I was looking for podcasts at the time because I have a long drive from San Francisco to our office, which is in the peninsula. And so I just turned on Healing Powers and let it play for a few weeks. And what I learned was that there were many people who were describing these similar types of experiences. And after a certain point, it hit me that, wait a second, they're all saying this. They're not like joking. So either they're just lying or delusional, or there's some truth to what they're saying. And that led me to get really interested in looking at the actual science behind it. And then everything spiraled. I saw more and more science that I'd never even heard of. And it was science from credible places, like from the US government, from Princeton University, from the University of Virginia, and from many other places. So I spent a year basically of just researching nonstop because I wanted to know. I had no plans of ever writing a book. So it was just, I wanted to understand reality because my perspective was this old view. The brain produces consciousness. Matter creates consciousness. When you take that out in terms of implications, if the body dies, then there's no consciousness. Your memories are gone. It's all gone. So what I used to think was there's no meaning to life because once you're dead, it's over. That's just what it implies. So I didn't want to rationalize life. I just accepted that. And I think it led to a pretty bleak outlook. And here I am questioning this. We're talking about consciousness not being localized to the body, surviving death, all kinds of stuff that I had never even really contemplated because it just didn't make sense. And it took, in terms of your question of like, when did it really click for me that this seemed like the most likely reality? It definitely took time. I would learn about things and then I'd kind of forget about them. Then I'd learn more and say, wait a second. And then I got to the point maybe a few months in where I couldn't reconcile my old worldview with all this new evidence that I was seeing. So I had no choice but to come up with something that could account for all these pieces of evidence. And then I found lots of information and lots of thinkers who have been thinking this way for a long time. And what I tried to do in my book is to summarize it for a modern general audience.
Wow. It's amazing, man. What did you notice that was different about your perspective and attitude about the world? You mentioned, life was meaningless, but more specifically, like on a day-to-day basis, what was the difference between back then before you discovered this and today, now that you have this 180-degree view?
I think it was more of going through the motions. And I would have acknowledged openly that I thought life had no meaning. It wasn't something I ran around talking about, but I would always think about, like, people are emotional. They have good and bad things that happen to them, and there are emotional swings that happen. So like a normal person, like that would happen to me. And then I would question, Mark, why do you even care? Why do you care so much about all these things? It's not going to matter in the end. And that's what would go through my mind. And now I have a very different perspective where there seems to be at least some meaning in the sense that our consciousness continues beyond the body. And exactly what that meaning is, I think we have hints, but it can become a difficult question. However, there is something beyond the meaninglessness that I thought there was. And that has a big impact on how I just approach every day, how I think about life and death. And as we'll discuss, what is implied by this general idea is that we're connected at the level of consciousness. So it creates a less of a sense of separation between me and you and everyone else and the planet. It creates more of an accountability on a personal level and also on a collective level. And that's been a big shift for me. Not that I didn't care about people, but it's not the same as my current view, which actually says beyond the similarities in our genetics, because we're the same species, so we all have similar genetics. Beyond that, there is a connection that we don't see with our eyes.
Right. And that totally leads to a different experience of reality. If you look at like for example, the homeless person, right? A lot of people say when you see a homeless person, it's like, it's so foreign. It's so like, that's not who I want to be. I don't poverty, gross. And like it's another human being, but they're so unrecognizable as the same as us or a mirror reflection of us that like we totally disassociate. And I think that there's a part in ourselves that we kill when we make a decision like that and cut that part of us off. Is that something that has crossed your mind or you discussed?
Completely. Yeah, I think that the perspective that you just described, which is the perspective that is implied by most of modern thinking, it misses the point that there is a commonality to every person. And it kind of breaks down the barriers of judgment and positions that we might take on things. Which is a big shift versus how society teaches us to think about things. So yeah, I found that I'm much more I think of people as much more being equals and look at the material achievements in a different lens.
Yeah.
I think from just coming from the investment banking world, there you can easily come up with hierarchies of people within that world, of people that you respect versus not respect, on the basis of what the material achievements are alone.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is a different type of a judgment. It's not even a judgment. It's kind of an acceptance that is not implied by the conventional worldview.
Yeah. What is like your ultimate mission with this information and with your book? To like, what are you out to really accomplish?
I decided to write the book, like I alluded to, on a whim almost. I had been telling friends about the research I was doing within that year of research, and I was getting really positive responses from people. People told me that it was shifting their perspectives in some cases. That's the life-changing thing. I mean, the same way that it was life-changing for me. And I realized that I had all this knowledge in my head, and people were responding well to it, and I decided to write the book. I wrote more than half of it over a long weekend in July of 2017, where I just kind of everything in my head came out, and then over the next few weekends, I finished it. And when I sat down to write it, I guess there were a few things I had in mind. One is that I went through a personal journey that required a lot of digging around and a lot of looking through esoteric stuff, looking through PhD research, just things that not a lot of people, at least in my circles, were doing. So what the book did was provide people with kind of the best of this information so that they wouldn't have to spend a full year where I didn't do much other than my day job and this research. They could hopefully read the book and get the summary of what's there. And I thought that would be a service to people, individuals who wanted to go through that transformation or a shift. And I think that's one, maybe on the small side is the goal. But beyond that, I think our society has some big, big problems that are obvious to all of us when we turn on the news any given day. And I think those problems, to me, they're not due to individuals being malicious. They're not due to just many of the conventional explanations that we hear. Many of the explanations I hear are kind of surface level. The deeper problem to me is a misunderstanding of reality.
Wow.
The problem is the belief that we're separate beings who have a finite existence in a single body, and that's it. And then there's no more consciousness. If that assumption is not correct, and that we're actually connected and consciousness is this fundamental thing, then a lot of the problems we see in the world would not make sense anymore. People would not, if one internalized those ideas, that's a big if. If they did, then they would not be rational to act in the ways that we're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you feel is unique about your perspective and how you put the information together that hasn't been done in other sources or journals or scientific research and reports?
I'm glad you asked that. The way I wrote the book was kind of filling what I thought was a gap or a hole in the literature, where many of the books covered a specific topic. So you can read a whole book on near-death experiences, a whole book on children who have past life memories, a whole book on telepathy and psychic abilities. I have not seen quite as many books that bring them all together and provide a framework that can account for them, which is this, consciousness is first, and talk about the implications for these things we're talking about, life and death and the world. So I hadn't seen all those concepts in many pieces of literature together. On top of that, much of the research was either very technical, written by PhDs, or kind of not scientific enough, where the ideas I probably would agree with, but if using my logical mind, if you asked me 3 years ago, I just wouldn't have bought it because there's no evidence. So what I wanted to do was combine the relatability with the scientific part of it and make it something that anyone can read, a general audience, but also everything's backed by science. Everything is footnoted. And so that combination was something I had not seen.
Wow, that's awesome, man. And based on what you've said, you said that people are reading it and they're saying, "Wow, this is changing my worldview of like my life." Can you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of results people could expect when reading the book?
Well, I think in some ways it's an experiment because I have a few cases of friends and people that are close to me that have been exposed to the information. So what I can give you is what's happened to some of them, and certainly not all. And then the book's been out for a few months.
That's awesome, man.
It's going to take time for people to absorb the information. So one caveat I would say is that it's not an overnight shift necessarily. someone who has a near-death experience or some kind of a mystical experience in meditation, that can be like an overnight thing where they're a different person. And that's what happens often. Here with this information, even for me, it was not overnight. Mm-hmm. It took a lot of time of thinking about it and saying, wait, no, that can't be right. I've been living my whole life like this. How can that be right?
Right.
It was that back and forth for a while. Totally. So for people who get into this for the first time, it might be that kind of an experience where reading my book is the first exposure, and who knows how long in the future it could be. But it might lead to a shift in thinking about life and death, and maybe a bit of relief if death is not as grim as we think it is. And if we're interconnected, it might change how people start thinking about their interactions. Mm-hmm.
And something that came up for me is we were talking about identity at the beginning of this, alignment with the identity. And I know the ego has a strong grip on like holding on to what is and what it has been, you know, like being right and things like that. So I'm curious, like, what are you finding that like is working about how people understand the ego and the identity, and how to like detach from it and become open to seeing things from a new perspective? What are you finding with that?
The way I'm seeing it unfold, and this is kind of what happened for me, is that when you hear these ideas for the first time, it's like you can't unhear it. So all of a sudden, everything that you experience in your life or every memory you think about, all of a sudden there's this alternative explanation, whether you buy it or not. It's just this other possibility of like, well, here's the conventional materialist perspective on how they'd explain it. And then wait, there's this thing that Mark wrote about, which kind of sounds crazy, but if that were true, then this is how it would work.
Yeah.
And once you have this dueling system in your mind, I think it starts to chip away at the rigidness of what you're calling the ego. And the way I think about the ego is kind of the positions that we have taken on of what we think is, and that is created by our biological structure. So if we are a consciousness experiencing the body, our biology is informing, it's the lens of the experience that we have. Right. And part of that is the way we think and the way we judge. And that's kind of how I think about the ego. Yeah. And when we rethink our identity, that is breaking down what one might call the ego. It means the ego, that body, and it's everything it produces, that's not in charge. That our consciousness is our identity. So all of the judgments of the ego and all of the positions that the ego takes on this is good versus bad, it starts to at least be put into question based on this new identity of I am a consciousness that is experiencing the ego, experiencing the body.
Yeah, powerful. And in terms of like we've talked a lot about this, it's kind of theory right now, and I want to take it into like how people can actually apply this to be more successful, you know, and to achieve their goals more. And I think that ego and identity and how you view the world, if that's rigid, it's difficult to succeed. Or, you know, like if you do succeed, it might be at the cost of people. You might hurt people. You might do like whatever it takes, versus a more holistic, kind of flexible, solution focused view and of consciousness. Viewing, you know, through the body, so to speak, like consciousness is the source, viewing through the experience of the body. Like how can we apply that to really change our ability to succeed and take more bold or courageous action? Like what have you found with that?
Well, I think it does redefine success. That success is not always just a material success. If it's at the expense of somebody else, and if one internalizes these ideas of interconnectedness, there's probably some cognitive dissonance internally, even if you don't say it. I had all this success, but it was at those people's expenses. That's got to cause some internal issues that maybe don't show up for a while, but it's like some guilt. So if you recontextualize identity and think about yourself as being interconnected, success might be more tied to other people's benefits in addition to your own. So thinking about how your actions are affecting others, and hopefully in a positive way, in addition to treating yourself well. I'm not discounting that, but it's kind of the both part of it, of treating yourself well and making sure success hopefully involves the success of others in some way, whether it's direct or indirect.
Yeah. So at a kind of micro level and action tactical level, and if if and when we adopt this perspective of we're all connected, we might be more willing to slow down and hold the door open for someone. We might be more willing to see someone who's struggling and go over and help them, or ask, hey, do you need help? Because we know that we're way more connected. And if we help them, we're also helping ourselves, so to speak, the us, the I, because we're helping them, but really it's all a we in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. This puts a new spin on altruism. Yeah. Altruism is where we want to help others. Yeah. That, under this perspective, is actually a form of selfishness, because you're helping yourself by helping others. And like we talked about, it puts any other individual or anything in this physical world on a much more even playing field. Yeah. So whether it's a cashier at the store or someone that you might normally consider less significant in your life than someone else, all of a sudden those people take on more significance. And I want to point out something from my chapter on near-death experiences. This is one of the biggest takeaways of the whole book, I think. So a near-death experience is an instance where a person is in a severe physiological trauma. Mm-hmm. For example, cardiac arrest. That's a good example because many studies have been done. This is a person who's clinically dead, and yet they are having lucid memories. They hover over their body. They see deceased loved ones. They feel unconditional love. There are debates over whether this is a hallucination or not, and I argue for many reasons it does not seem like a hallucination. For one, sometimes what the people describe as happening in the room when they're hovering over their body is shown to be accurate. Yeah. So that's by definition not a hallucination.
Boom! Stamp of approval.
But that's I spent a whole chapter on it. One of the phenomena that happens in this event, which I do not think is a hallucination, is a life review. Okay. So people describe seeing their whole life in a flash, and they're judging themselves for how they acted towards people. What they're judging is, was I nice to this person? Was I mean to this person? Did I hurt this person? They're not judging how much money did I make when I was age X. They're not judging themselves on material things. The other thing that happens sometimes is that they take on the perspective of the people they affected in that life review. Wow. So they might feel the pain that they inflicted through that other person's eyes. Okay, so if we take those things literally, it starts to put questions into the idea of meaning in life. Is the meaning of life to foster the sense of interconnectivity and treat others well because we're connected? And that means every person, that there is no person less significant.
Wow, that's powerful. And that life review, in personal development, we hear about doing an obituary, right? Reading your obituary when you're like in the casket, so to speak, and someone's like reading about your life and what happened and what you achieved, and you like get to see what you accomplished through their eyes, and then it's through that exercise that you're able to really see, hey, what do I want to be said about me at the end of my life? What is really important? And the ability to put ourselves in that moment is so powerful and profound to find out what is our truth, what is really important to us. Have you noticed that?
Completely. And in a way I like to think about it is that we come into the body with nothing physical and we leave the body with nothing physical. All that occurs is the evolution of our consciousness, really, the experiences that we have and the way that we acted. So if you really buy into that for a second, it's like, wait a second, the physical stuff is temporary, even though it feels so, we don't like to think about it as being temporary because that can be depressing, but it's temporary in the physical. And if that's true, that all that we carry with us is however we evolved our consciousness, which is what is implied by the life review and some of these exercises, they put that into the focus. Then what really matters is the ways in which we are evolving our consciousness.
How do we know if our consciousness has evolved to the quote unquote infinite amount and it's like ready to not come back for another ride, so to speak?
I'm not sure. I don't know. But a concept that seems to come up, and this is not as scientifically verifiable, but I see it so many times that I wonder about it. The idea is that a property of this consciousness itself, consciousness being the basis of the physical, a property of consciousness is that it's constantly evolving, right? And that there is no end to the evolution. I can't prove that. I can't disprove it. But if you buy into that, I think it's not a huge leap to say that might be true based on this whole universe we see. It seems like it's like an evolutionary playground for consciousness, almost. Then there's no end to it if that's true. If it's kind of an infinite evolution, then there's always things that can be learned.
Yeah. Yeah, I read a book, I think it's Conversations with God, that talks about, like, it's like the wholeness of consciousness is like all that there is. It's ever present, like all that there is, and then we have this universe which is like a shard of all that there is, right? And we temporarily lost our knowing that we are all that is, to have an experience of ourselves by first being quote unquote disconnected and then rediscovering ourselves along the journey. Is that similar to your view?
That's where I'm leaning right now, more than any other direction.
Yeah.
I think these topics of what is the purpose of all this stuff,
Yeah.
when you ask why questions, we have limitations, I think, in the way our brain is structured. So I like to think of the brain as a filter of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So if consciousness is the sun, then our brain and our thoughts, those are like clouds. And we have kind of limited machinery and lots of clouds inherent in this biological system. And yet we're trying to think about concepts that might be multidimensional, and we're stuck in this dimension. But I think the short answer is, I think something like what you just described and what Neil Donald Walsh and others described is probably, I think it makes sense. There's a term I like that summarizes it well. Some people call it the cosmic game of hide and seek.
Wow. I love it. I love it. I have an aspiration to live forever, right? And I'm curious, like the technology is totally coming, right? I'm like 27 years old. I think it's like the perfect opportunity for that to come into existence in my lifetime, because I think, who was it? Someone was talking about the escape velocity of like your lifespan, right? Like we're getting more years back than is being taken off at this point. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, living forever. Is that something that think people are going to aspire to? Is that something that could work for the universe? What are your thoughts on that?
So when you say immortality, you mean biological immortality?
Yes, biological. Yeah.
Okay, right. That's the big distinction. And I think a lot of the reason we probably see such a desire in science and in culture is because of the materialist assumption that the brain produces consciousness. And if that's true, then it kind of makes sense, because once you die, it's over, and therefore trying to prolong the physical body is all that matters.
Right.
If you really want to live, if you like the physical life.
Right.
For me, it's not as relevant as it used to be, because it seems like there's a lot of other stuff going on. If we're dealing with the evolution of consciousness, then the experiences we're having in the body are geared towards that. And if that evolution can be acquired through a longer biological life, then that makes sense. Right. But if that evolution doesn't need an infinite body, a body with an infinite life, then it serves the same purpose, but not having an infinite life. It serves a purpose in X number of years. So I'm much more indifferent on it. Yeah,
I appreciate that. And I think that not having fear, I think you've come to terms with the research a lot more than me. And I'm at this point where, like, I'm still operating out of like playing a video game, right? And like at the end of the video game, if I die, then I lose the game, or I have to start over, or whatever else it might be. And that like kills my growth, so to speak. It stops me evolving. It shorts my potential, so to speak. And I think that there was an aspect of, man, I hope I get to experience all the infiniteness of this life while I'm here, so that I can have that pleasurable experience and have fun and play on the playground, so to speak. And I think that there's a knowingness and a faith that I can step into to really appreciate the journey more and not make it about 20 or 30 years from now, and rather just be in the present moment. And I can source the future for power and for being and for awareness. And like we can step into that future moment and say, who would I be if it was 20 years from now and I was accomplishing and achieving all these things? How would I show up? Right. And if that's important to us, and like that may not be as relevant if it's just about enjoying the ride and evolving each moment.
Right. I think one's position on this would depend on what matters in life.
Yeah.
At the cosmic level. Why are we here and what are we doing? If it's just about evolving in targeted ways in this body, then maybe that's only needed. We only need a certain number of years for it. And if that's all that matters, then the desire for immortality is a construction of the biological ego.
Totally. Dang, Mark, this is incredible, man. Let's talk about some more chapters of the book, because I know we've only scratched the surface, and I know, like, if anyone is even like remotely as interested in this as I am, definitely go get the book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. Go get it, and let's talk a little bit more about those chapters, man. What else are we going to find in the book?
So I talk about quantum mechanics. I have a chapter on that, which I think is important to just briefly mention, because the reality that we're raised in and the one that we see on a day-to-day basis with our eyes is a Newtonian reality. And what I mean is that it abides by the laws of Newton, where you like drop an apple and the apple falls to the ground because of gravity. These are things that we can see very easily. And Newtonian physics has been extremely successful in helping us learn about reality. The problem is that it's not 100% accurate. It's like an approximation. When we start to get into the quantum realms and other realms too, but things that we cannot see with our eyes, then we see things that are totally counterintuitive. We see things like entanglement, where particles that are physically distant from each other, they seem to have a connection, because when you affect one, the one that's far away has an instantaneous effect. Which is, so they're mind-boggling things that are just totally counterintuitive. And I want to preface with that, because the phenomena that I spend most of the book talking about are also counterintuitive. And I think that what's important to remember is that just because something does not make sense according to our Newtonian eyes does not mean it's not real.
Right. And then there's like a history of feeling and knowing and tapping into like the nature of things to source the wisdom, to source the guidance, the direction, versus like biological and mechanical thinking and thoughts and logic. You know, there's like almost this unseen intuition and flow and river of life that guides us to like our growth and our evolution. Is that something else that you go into in the book?
Yeah, it's one of the abilities that I talk about. So I have two sections after the quantum physics section. One is on different psychic ability, and the other is on evidence for the survival of bodily death. And the examples of psychic abilities, and one of them I'll get back to in a second. I have one on remote viewing, which is the ability to see something that's far away, but you're not seeing it with your eyes. You see it with your mind. You've never seen it before. Telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. Chapter on that. Precognition. This is knowing the future before it happens. And I want to return to this one to get back to your point. Psychokinesis, which is the ability for the mind to affect physical matter without any physical contact. So those are the psychic abilities I talk about. And I also have a chapter on animals, which suggests that animals have some of these abilities. And then the second section, or the next section, is on survival of bodily death. Chapter on near-death experiences. A chapter on communications with the deceased, like psychic mediums and other things, and another chapter on children who have past life memories. That's research at the University of Virginia. So that's what the book spans. I want to get back to precognition, because it gets back to your question about intuition. What we see with precognition is the ability for consciousness to seemingly know the future before the future happens. We might call that intuition. That's how we experience it. But it seems that this happens, and it's not a logical process. It's like sometimes people have a precognitive dream, where they are dreaming an event before it happens. And it's not like they were able to logically pull that together. It just came to them. It's sort of like the rays of the sun.
Is it called deja vu as well? Is that same thing?
I don't talk about that specifically. There are some people would use that as an explanation for deja vu. And there are lots of explanations. I'm not sure what the answer is, but it might have to do with this idea that consciousness, in addition to being more fundamental than physical matter, is beyond all space and time. And when that happens, you start to get funky things happening with time. And we see studies that I refer to in the book where people's bodies are responding to a stimulus that they're seeing before it's even shown by a computer. It's randomly shown by a computer, and their body is responding seconds before, completely unconsciously, and yet it's happening. So it's like somehow the body knows the future before anyone knows the future.
That's incredible. So, why is it important for us to know this? Specifically the precognition.
Well, I use it as one example of many to point towards the idea that materialism is not correct, that the brain does not produce consciousness, and rather consciousness is fundamental, consciousness is primary. And all of those chapters that I talked about, what I argue is that if any of those things are true, if any of them are scientifically true, then we can explain them very well if consciousness is beyond all space and time and beyond anything material. We can't explain them. well if consciousness comes from the brain. So precognition fits into that, where we can explain. It points in this direction of consciousness being fundamental, but I think on a more practical level, it tells us something about our own intuition and our own knowing. When we have a sense for something, even though we can't logically break down how we got to that sense, maybe there's something to it beyond what we can reason.
Consciousness is beyond all time and space. What is faith and seeing something in the mind or in the consciousness, so to speak, like being able to create it through consciousness, the possibility, right? How does that affect? How do those, what research have you done on that? Faith and possibility and seeing it in the mind before it's even become a reality.
I think the closest thing that I get to there is on the topic of psychokinesis, where the mind is affecting physical matter. Yeah. And the classic study where this is done at a very small scale, these were studies done at Princeton. There was a lab run by the former dean of engineering there for 27 years. He was a rocket scientist. I didn't know about the lab when I was an undergrad there because it was such a controversial area. And that's something I talk about in the book, is that this is highly controversial science. Wow. And one of the reasons I felt so compelled to write about it.
Yeah.
But what we see in those studies are machines. They're called random number generators. Mm-hmm. These are machines that will spit out a 0 or a 1 in a random fashion. And when you look at a long string of zeros and ones, you end up with 50% ones, 50% zeros, because it's random. Right. In the studies, you ask people to put their mental attention to it. Set the intention for the machine to produce more ones than zeros at a distance. So the person's not touching the machine, they're not next to it, and they're trying to influence the behavior of the numbers. And sure enough, they have a very small but highly statistically significant effect, where it's statistically more ones than zeros. So what they're holding in mind is having an effect on the physical world. And I think that's what you were kind of alluding to, of how is our mental thinking about things manifesting in the physical world. Yeah. What these studies suggest is that there is at least some impact, even though it might be small sometimes.
Yeah. How does emotion, have you done any research on how emotion changes that on psychokinesis?
I think more research needs to be done on these nuances. But one of the things that they have found with the random number generators is that when people are not trying as hard, they perform better. So there's like a pattern that they see, which is that in the beginning, people are kind of relaxing and then they start thinking about it too much.
Right.
And their performance goes down. And then they kind of relax and then they end up doing better.
Wow.
It's kind of like an allowing almost and not forcing that seems to produce better results. But your question about the intensity of emotions and how does that influence the physical world? I think where we see emotions show up most in the research that I've come across. There might be some on this, but again, it's such scattered research that we don't know very well. With telepathy, where there's mind-to-mind communication, the effects are strongest statistically when there's an emotional closeness between the individuals.
Wow.
So the statistics are stronger when you have a mother-child or identical twins, where there's strong evidence about twins and telepathy. The effects are stronger when there's an emotion behind it.
Wow. And that's like with me and my girlfriend, we feel like we complete each other's sentences, and like, she was just gonna say that and then I say it, or there's things like that. It's just so incredible that we're deeper connected. I found that trust is a big thing to create that emotional closeness. Like if this person knows like everything about me and I don't feel like I have to like guard myself or be someone around them specifically, and I can just be myself, then like you said, the allowing seems to be make things easier, make the connection even more strong.
Yeah. Yep. I've experienced that myself with people, and that's what the research seemed to point to also.
That's awesome, man. I love it. So what is what's the research, the focus, the biggest focus of your research going on in 2019? What do you see as the big thing that you want to really invest into exploring, discovering, getting more scientific evidence and I think it's called corroboration for? Like what's that going to be?
I don't always know where the research is going to take me. That's kind of how it's been from the beginning.
That's awesome.
I don't have a great answer because I don't know the answer. I'm constantly curious about things, and I could pick up a book that will lead me in a direction that I can't expect. I think generally my interests are as follows. I want to understand reality in the purest sense.
Yeah.
What is this reality that we are in? And whatever can lead me to get to an answer is something I'm interested in. And then a a corollary to that is, given the reality that seems to be real, how should one be in the world? What is the best way to be given that reality? So that's generally where my interests lie. How that will manifest, I don't know.
That's powerful. I was doing an exercise earlier today about things that I stand for and things that I don't stand for to find out what my core values are. And I believe that understanding reality and how to be in reality is one of those core values. Is there a way that you could like identify what that is? Is it growth? Is it evolution? Is it awakening, ascension, enlightenment? Like, what would you call that general process if you had to put a word or two to it?
I think it is the recognition and then the eventual internalization of the idea that our identity is consciousness rather than a physical person.
Wow.
We're a consciousness, not a person. We're a consciousness that's experiencing the person. So the evolution to me is first the recognition of that at an experiential or intellectual level, and then the living of it.
How does like being a researcher and a stand for this information impact your business relationships? What have you seen with that?
The worlds are pretty separate. They're pretty separate.
I love it, man. I love it. So do you think you'll build the brand of this so that it's self-sustaining, or is that like not a goal, or not self-sustaining, but like more than that, abundantly lucrative, and people who are hungry for this come to you to get trained in it, to be able to access the the joy and the bliss and the understanding that we are consciousness first versus the physical reality? Is that something that is something you're aspiring to?
The answer is I really don't know. It's
One
been
day
an
at a time.
organic process since the beginning, where I just decided, why don't I put this on paper? Wrote the book and got really lucky and found an agent and a publisher. And now the book's out. It's been out for a few months. And now I'm doing lots of interviews and speaking.
Yeah.
I think it probably will depend on two things. One is what my interests are, where I feel my passions are pulling me. Yeah. And number two, what the reactions are from people. It's still a bit early. And there might be a common thread of people saying, I love this and I want more of this.
Yeah.
Can you give it to me in a certain way?
Yeah.
And without knowing that yet, it's hard for me to say exactly where it'll go.
Yeah. What are you finding more fulfilling about your business and about being an investment banker? What is more important to you and more valuable, and you're even more grateful and appreciative for the experience of X, Y, or Z in your career?
Well, what's interesting is that many people in the financial world haven't been as exposed to these ideas, where it's totally new to them. And because I've been in that world for so long, people will at least listen to the first sentence and maybe open page 1 of my book.
That's awesome.
So that to me is the biggest thing, where there's a whole important segment of the population that I think could probably have an enhancement in their lives as a result of this, especially in the investment banking world. When I worked in New York during the financial crisis, I saw a lot of things there. Yeah, this mentality that we're talking about was not prevalent. I can say that. And it helps people like that, because they say, oh, wow, Mark worked in investment banking during the crisis, and so did I. Let me look at this for a second.
Wow.
I think I have the potential to impact people that maybe were not reachable before.
Amazing, man. Amazing. I love this, Mark. This is incredible. And we're beginning to come to the end of this. And we want to know, like, what are the final pieces of wisdom, or if there's anything that we didn't cover in the interview that you feel is a core part of your message, or a building block to be able to understand and conceptualize it. If we want to cover that right now, that'd be an awesome opportunity to do so.
I think talking briefly about the relationship between the brain and consciousness is really important, because your listeners might be wondering, wait a second, don't we already know that the brain produces consciousness? Isn't that a given? What I didn't realize until I started researching is that, according to Science Magazine, it's the number 2 question in all of science.
Wow.
And the way they phrase it is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, how is it that this biology, like I can touch my arm, I can touch my head, can't touch my consciousness. How does that happen? How does the physical body produce a non-physical consciousness? That's the big question. It's called the hard problem of consciousness in philosophical circles.
I love it.
Right? How does consciousness just emerge out of matter? No one knows the answer. So number one, let's just establish mainstream thinking has no clue how this happens. All we know is that there's a relationship where if you stimulate the brain, you might get a corresponding effect in your consciousness. Get in a car accident, you might have memory loss. So we change the brain, we change consciousness. Why is that not sufficient to then say, okay, we're done, brain produces consciousness? It's because we can't say that correlation is causation. So let's say you have a fire and firefighters show up. This is an analogy from a philosopher, Bernardo Castro. Larger fire, more firefighters. Strong correlation. The size of the fire and the number of firefighters, strong relationship. Are we concluding that the firefighters caused the fire? Right? There's an alternative explanation when we have two things that are correlated. So the alternative with the brain and consciousness, the brain's correlated with consciousness, highly related. It just might be we're viewing the brain incorrectly. That if we view the brain as being a filtering mechanism, where consciousness exists kind of independently and our brain filters it in. So we experience a sliver. Or a broader metaphor, which is not as precise, but it's like to consider the brain an antenna. We're picking up a signal. You damage the antenna on your TV, you're going to see a scratchy show.
Totally.
But the signal has not been damaged.
Wow. That's powerful. And I think it's like what causes the damage to the antenna, right? Like it's the what was coming through the consciousness, why the body, like attracted that, so to speak, the damage to have to go through the experience of the consciousness having to deal with that damage or that, ability to evolve in a different way, a different like path of evolution. It's so incredible.
Right. It makes the biology, the television set, in the analogy, it makes it seem like the vehicle of the evolutionary experience. It's a vehicle.
Yeah. And I love how you said it's like, I imagine the brain is the physical matter and hooking up to it is like, let's say consciousness wires. And there's like a bunch of them, like trillions or whatever, however many that are hooked up to the brain. And like consciousness, when it flows through, it signals the brain mechanisms and neurons to start firing to produce certain thoughts or to produce certain actions and movements and even, body changes, chemistry changes, biological changes. And it's like if we see it like that, then we can choose our consciousness to flow through and like change the matter in our body, it's incredible.
Exactly. It's a whole rethinking of things. And this is why I think the conversation is so important. But I hope your audience will hear this and say, okay, I don't know if I buy it, but this is an alternative explanation. And over time, that can be really impactful.
My gosh, I love it, Mark. Well, we want to know, how do we stay connected with you? How do we get this book? What's the best way to do it? Because this is incredible conversation, and I believe anyone who's living on Earth deserves to know about this conversation and entertain it and invest in it. And at least, like I love what you said earlier. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. At least explore the possibility, because if you don't, then you're being closed-minded and afraid of your ego, like afraid of your identity and losing what was, up until this point. And I know our audience wants to evolve and become their greatest possible self. So how do they do that, man? How do they stay connected with you?
My website, which is my name, Mark Gober, MarkGober.com, has more information on me and my book, and Into Upside Down Thinking. And the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, many bookstores. It's in hardcover, ebook, audiobook. So if you're interested in any modality, it's there.
I love it. I love it, Mark. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, man. I'm stoked to see the research you come out with. I'm stoked to see like who you become because of this and the movement that is created, the ripple effect that is created in the world because of who you are being and the consciousness that is flowing through you, that you're choosing to flow through you and create this reality. And man, it's really amazing. Thank you for being a reflection of me, and we're in this together, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all that you're doing. I love the work that you're doing.
Thank you, brother. We'll see you soon, okay?
Okay. Take care.